This morning's session is entitled The Geneva Bible, How God's Outlaws Created America. Now, at this point in my life, I'm 82 years old. I've been reading the Bible since I was about 15, studying the Bible. I've been a pastor, teaching all over the world, used a number of different translations of the scripture, and I had never heard of the Geneva Bible. So 2 or 3 years ago, I heard a dialogue between two people, and the Geneva Bible came up, and thought, what's that? The title of the lecture and the subtitle came from historian Stephen Tompkins' book on the journey of the Mayflower, God's Outlaw and the Invention of Freedom. So what this historian was saying was that the people that came on the Mayflower, the settlers of the original colonies were, he called them outlaws, because they were fleeing from England to avoid the punishment of English laws for being Protestants. How exactly did the Bible shape the founding of the United States? That's the question I want to answer. In the conversation I heard a few years ago, one of the participants was named Naomi Wolf. I don't know how many of you know that name. Naomi Wolf is of Jewish heritage. She's a modern feminist, a journalist, and was an advisor to our previous president, Clinton. She realized that the Geneva Bible was not simply a religious text, but it was a revolutionary manual for building free societies. And this is what she said. I was searching for the earliest English translation of the Bible from the Hebrew. And that's because of her Jewish background. Because, of course, I am seeking guidance and comfort in a time of chaos and crisis. The 1560 Geneva Bible, which I have been reading, has completely astonished me. The Geneva Bible is incredibly subversive and liberating and awe-inspiring, just as the original Hebrew is transformational and liberating and awe-inspiring. Reading it, I understood why the Puritans would give up everything and sail across unknown seas to create a sacred community in the wilderness. I understood what gave our founders the courage to challenge the greatest empire on earth at the time. So here's this woman in a moment of crisis in her own life, and she's trying to find inspiration. The Bible comes across the Geneva Bible, and she said it was revolutionary. And that, for someone who's studied the Bible for years, using numbers of different translations, never having heard of the Geneva Bible, oh, well, this is something I need to look into. Before the Reformation, the Bible was available only in Latin. And if you wanted to have information about the Bible, you'd have to go to the priests, because it was the priests who understood Latin and could teach from the Bible. In the reign of Bloody Mary in England, Protestants were systematically persecuted. Queen Mary was trying to get rid of the Protestants from England and return Catholicism to England. And at this time, 800 English scholars fled to Europe. Many of them were theologians and Hebrew scholars, Greek scholars, and many of these fled to Calvin's city of Geneva. And they found refuge in Geneva. And Geneva at the time was called the Little Republic. They translated the Bible into the English from Hebrew and Greek. And this was the first time that the Bible had been translated to English from the original languages. In the past, it had been translated from the Latin. And the Hebrew scholars that were working on the Old Testament would read the rabbinic commentaries, the ancient rabbinic commentaries in the Pentateuch, the first books of Moses. And they learned a lot from those commentaries. And they discovered the revolutionary concept of the Hebrew Republic. I had never heard of the Hebrew Republic, again, until about 3 years ago. I did know that God had chosen a poor, enslaved Hebrew people to bring them out of slavery and create a free, flourishing, godly nation that would bless all the nations of the earth. I knew that from my study of Scripture, but I had no idea of the concept of the Hebrew Republic. But these scholars wrestled with the revolutionary question, are people to be ruled by the sovereign God or by a sovereign monarch? That was the thing. Where does authority reign? With a monarch or with God himself? And they noticed that until 1000 BC, the Old Testament revealed that God was the great sovereign king over the Hebrew people. And the Hebrew people stood before the face of God for their guidance, for their leadership. But we see recorded in Deuteronomy 17, 14 through 20, 1 Samuel 8, 4 through 22, that the Hebrew people decided they wanted a king like all other nations. They no longer wanted God to be their sovereign. They wanted a human sovereign. This concept of the Hebrew Republic I gained from a book by Dr. Eric Nelson titled The Hebrew Republic. And in this, he writes, man inhaled the emptiness of monarchy like a desert mirage, worshiping kings in whom there is no help, rather than the true heavenly king, and his punishment has accordingly been great. It was this aspect of the rabbinic tradition that in the hands of Christian exegetes would transform Republican political thought. This isn't capital R Republican, it's small r Republican. The Geneva Bible scholars discovered that the Pentateuch of Moses had established a political structure that would transform a slave nation into a free nation. How do you take a slave nation and turn it into a free nation? How do you take a poor country and turn it into a country that's flourishing for all her people? That is the concept of the Hebrew Republic. And these principles became foundational to the founding of the United States. Generally, there were four big ones: the concept of covenant between people and God, and this established a constitutional relationship based on mutual consent of the governed. The second was the rule of law. Laws reigned supreme over the whims of rulers. The law is king, not the king. And that was a very important concept. The separation of powers. Man is fallen. And you don't want one man or one family to have too much power, be it in the church or in the government, because power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so they wanted to separate the powers and created the concept within governance of an executive branch, a legislative branch, and a judicial branch. Very consciously done so that all the power of creating laws, executing laws, and judging laws didn't reside in a single person, like a king. And it created the concept of federalism, where you devolve power between the central and the regional authorities and the local governments. So you have a city government, you have a state government, you have a federal government, and each have their defined powers. And again, that keeps too much power residing in any one place. So those were four of the key elements of a constitutional covenantal republic. What is the uniqueness of this Bible, this Geneva Bible? Well, first, it was the first English Bible, as I mentioned, that was translated from the original Hebrew and Greek. And it was the first Bible to be printed in a Roman type rather than a Gothic script, so it made it easier for people to read. It's the first true study Bible because it had notes, annotations, commentary, cross-references built into the Bible. It was the first English Bible with chapter and verse divisions for easy reference. And it was the first portable and affordable Bible. Before the Reformation, very few people could read and write. Bibles were handwritten. Books were handwritten and were very expensive. And here suddenly is a Bible that the common person could own. Dr. Marshall Foster, who is with the Mayflower Institute and very active in reviving, bringing the treasure of the Geneva Bible back so that people knew about it, said this: the Geneva Bible was an instant success that captured the hearts of the people with its powerful, uncompromising prose and more than 300,000 words of annotation, commentary, things that were talking about what passages meant. The marginal notes of the Geneva Bible served to liberate believers from the ignorance, heresy, and tyranny of the Middle Ages. The Geneva Bible supported critical thinking. It encouraged people to think critically. It supported both individual and small group Bible studies. It reinforced the Reformation's focus on the priesthood of all believers, reducing hierarchical power in government and in the church, and empowered the concept that has been so important in the United States founding of we the people. It empowered we the people towards self-government based on Christ's commission. We the people are to be self-governing, and we'll be talking about this in more detail. And it laid the foundation for free, self-governing republics. The Geneva Bible was the primary Bible of the English Reformation. It was the source of language and culture that shaped the United States of America, or what would become the United States. And it was the Bible of such scholars as William Shakespeare, John Donne, John Knox, Oliver Cromwell, and others. This was the Bible they read and studied and wrote from the ideas that they found there. From 1620 to 1640 is a period of time known as the Great Puritan Migration. And this is when the Puritans left England and came across the Atlantic Ocean to establish colonies. And they were inspired by the deliverance of the Hebrew people out of Egypt. They saw God delivering the Hebrew people out of Egypt and bringing them into the promised land. They saw this as their inspiration for what they were doing. God brought the Hebrew people out of Egypt, across the Red Sea into the promised land, and he's going to bring them out of England across the great ocean to this new world where they would be able to not only have religious freedom, but for the Puritans, they had a concept from Scripture that the Bible is comprehensive and holistic. It's not just for spiritual purposes, that the Bible is the owner's manual, where God, who has made us, has told us how we're to live, how we're to function, and that the Bible becomes the prism through which we look at all of life and all areas of life, that the Bible has principles that speak to art, speak to government, to economics. So the Pilgrims fled King James of England to cross the Atlantic Ocean to the land of the promise, the New World. And they were fleeing King James. This is where they were the outlaws. They were God's outlaws. King James, I grew up on the King James Bible. But I didn't know that the King James Bible was ordered by King James to be created in response to the Geneva Bible. I never knew that. And the Geneva Bible was the Bible of the English Reformation, and people were learning from the Bible about the concept of a Hebrew republic. God is sovereign. We don't need any sovereign but God. Well, King James didn't like that. So he had his own Bible commissioned, and that's the Bible I grew up on. I didn't know this until a few years ago. 20,000 people came through this great Puritan migration to settle in the colonies. And the Puritans really thought this through. They wanted to make sure they had shopkeepers, pastors, farmers, merchants, people that could shoe horses. They wanted to have a lot of different types of skills to come so that when they settled the New World, they would have all the people with different disciplines they needed to build a nation. And they left for religious freedom, but also to create a Hebrew republic in the New World. The United States was prepared, perhaps the only modern country founded not on a race, not on ethnicity, but on an idea. The idea of freedom. In Germany you have Germans. In Sweden you have the Swedes. In Denmark you have the Danes. These are countries formed around an ethnic identity. In the United States, what do you have? People from all over the world. And the nation was founded on the concept of freedom that they found in the scriptures. This idea of freedom originated directly from the Geneva Bible and the exposition of biblical principles and killer apps. We talked about killer apps last week and how there are applications from Scripture that created the means to address issues of economics and freedom and politics. And this was part of what the Geneva Bible brought. Noah Webster, who spent 25 years developing an American dictionary of the English Bible. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the American Dictionary of the English Bible, but Noah Webster understood that if you're going to create a new nation based on freedom, you need to have a language and the definition of words that reflect the principles of that nation. And so you just couldn't take an English Bible. You needed an American English Bible. And for 25 years, he developed this American Dictionary of the English Language so that America would have its own English dictionary that supported freedom. This Bible has been, brought to the light again in the last 50 years, and it's being produced again, and there's a lot of families that are doing homeschool that have these Noah Webster's 1828 American Dictionary. But Noah Webster said this: the moral principles and precepts contained in the scriptures ought to form the basis of all our civil constitution and laws. The moral principles of Scripture should be the foundation of our civil laws. All the miseries and evils which men suffer from race, from vice, from ambition, injustice, oppression, slavery, and war proceed from their despising or neglecting the precepts contained in the Bible. Where does war come from? Where does injustice come from? Where do all these things come from? When people deny or do not follow the precepts and principles of Scripture. I want to tell you a story about Dr. Jose Gonzalez. Dr. Gonzalez was born in Uruguay, raised in Spanish America, came to the United States. He's bilingual and was teaching at, I believe it was Liberty University. We met in the airport in Puerto Rico. I don't know how many years ago now. But we were there and got talking. You know, you're sitting in an airport waiting to go somewhere, and you get talking with the guy next to you. And I found out he's a professor. He's a Christian, teaches at Liberty. And we started talking about the difference between what happened in North America and what happened in South America. Because he'd lived in both continents, raised in a Spanish American context, Latin American context. And I said, from my study, I've been able to narrow down to a couple sentences what made the difference between North America and South America. And he said, Darrell, you need to know it was one word. I've been working pretty hard on this for years. I thought getting it down to a couple sentences was good. And here's this guy, this Christian scholar, saying, no, it was one word. And I looked him in the eye and I said, Dr. Gonzalez, what was that word? He said it was the word covenant. The settlers that came across from Northern Europe understood the concept of covenant. But there was a covenant. You had the Old Covenant. We call it the Old Testament today. But in the past, it's been the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. And a covenant is something that takes place between man and God. We know it most predominantly when we get married, and there's a marriage covenant. And you stand before God, and the man pledges to his bride that he will be faithful to her until death do us part. And that covenant that he makes with her, she makes with him, was done before God. So the concept of covenant was very strong. And when the people came from Northern Europe to the United States, they came as families with children, husbands and wives that were in a covenantal relationship. And Dr. Gonzalez said, when the Portuguese and the Spanish came, they didn't come as families. They came as single men, leaving their wives and children back in the old world. And when they came to the new world, they wanted to have sex. They wanted to have somebody to help take care of them, to cook their meals, to sew their clothes. And so they would take up with the women from indigenous tribes. And they would establish a new family because the concept of covenant meant nothing to them. And he said, so a whole system developed in South America where you could say something to another person, but it would mean nothing because you didn't have the concept of covenant. So two people could go into a business partnership and one could steal from the other because there wasn't the concept of covenant. And marriages weren't really marriages because there wasn't the covenant. And a whole culture developed without the concept of covenant, he's telling me. And it just, whereas in North America, families came over, they came over in a covenant marriage relationship. So it was the whole family that came to settle the land, not just the men from the old world. So the Old Testament understanding of covenant was incredibly important. God is a covenant-making God. The U.S. was founded on covenant-making people. You had the Mayflower Compact. That was a covenant. The compact was a covenant. You had the Massachusetts Bay Company Charter. That was a covenant. You had the Declaration of Independence and Constitution of the United States. That was the concept of a covenant for the governance of the nation. Dr. Donald Lutz from the University of Houston said this: "The Constitution is the product of a constitution-making tradition that can be traced to colonial charters and is modeled on the biblical idea of covenant, a solemn agreement between God and man. The colonists did not come over with John Locke in hand. They came over with the Bible in hand. And they came over with a particular Bible in hand, the Geneva Bible, which was the Bible that revealed the concept of the Hebrew Republic. And that's what shaped our government. That's very different than other governments in the free world." Again, Dr. Marshall Foster said this: "It is no exaggeration to say that the Geneva Bible was the most significant catalyst of the transformation of England, Scotland, and America from slavish feudalism to the heights of Christian civilization. As the first Bible to be read by the common people in English, the Geneva Bible inspired those who championed self-government, free enterprise, education, civic virtue, protection of women and children, and godly culture." That was the book that the Puritans and the Pilgrims came across the Atlantic with, the Bible, and a particular Bible, the Geneva Bible. The Geneva Bible liberated believers from ignorance and tyranny, the constitutional concept of limited government. It brought the end of slavery and a caste system. Now, when I say the end of slavery, the standard was set by the founders. All men are created equal. That was not practiced by all men. And so the elimination of slavery in our country took a while. But the gold standard, that there should be no slavery, existed. Free enterprise and private property concepts. The Protestant work ethic. One of the reasons that nations are poor is they don't have a work ethic. They see work as a curse. And if you can get wealthy without working, that's good. Now, the Protestant work ethic came from the Scripture, beginning in Genesis 2:2, where it says God rested from His work. Who established work? The Creator of the universe, our God. He worked. He worked to take His vision of the universe and create it. The wholesome standards in the arts and educational advancement and literacy. These are all things that the founders of this nation had in their hearts from reading the Geneva Bible. Back to Dr. Foster again, he's talking about reforming a pagan culture. The Geneva Bible providentially was unleashed upon a dark, discouraged, and downtrodden English-speaking world at a time when Christendom was in real danger of regressing to a form of Caesar worship. A Bible appeared that created the conditions for a Christian reformation of life and culture, the likes of which the world had never seen. Its hallmarks including the explosion of faith, an emphasis on integrity, a unique and vital missionary movement, creative literature, economic blessing, and political and religious freedom. What lifts nations out of poverty? What breaks the bonds of slavery? It's the Bible. The Bible is not simply a book to be put on a shelf. It's not simply a devotions manual. It's God's owner's manual. Here is how things were made to work. President John Adams said this: "We have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions unbridled by morality and religion." And I'm speaking this now to any North Americans that would hear this. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. And this is why the United States right now is spiraling down in cultural suicide. Because we have a Constitution that built this free nation. But this Constitution was made by and for people who were moral and religious. And it is not capable of governing any other. And as people in the United States, as they turn, and Europe, as they turn their back on God, they turn their back on the concept of freedom, the concept of a covenantal republic. They turn their back on these things, and their nations will decay and die. And those of you that are watching this from a non-Western concept, don't idolize the West. Return to the Bible. Return to the Bible not just as a devotional. Return to the Bible to study what it has to say about governance, about economics, about art, about architecture, about planning. This is where the foundations will come for your building of a free and flourishing nation. We need Christians today who will become God's outlaws. People willing to courageously challenge the contemporary ideologies and tyrants of our time by applying biblical truth to every sphere of society. May God touch you with that challenge and give you the courage and the grace to do so.